Good morning. It is good to see each of you here this morning. Grateful for your presence. If you're visiting with us, we want to welcome you and ask you to stick around. Let us get to know you a little better and invite you to come back and be with us again whenever you're able. Tim, good to see you. Tim Vines is here with us. It's been a while since he's had his neck surgery, and it's good to have him back with us today and brace-free. So it's glad you're here with us. In our introduction lesson last Sunday, when we began this series, we established that Matthew chapter 18 is a discourse that instructs those who actively follow Jesus how to interact with each other. And if you were not here last Sunday, I encourage you to go back and view the lesson either on the Stony Creek Facebook page or the YouTube page. It will really help you gain a more complete understanding of what this chapter is addressing. But I do want to spend just a few moments and do a brief recap to freshen our memories. In chapter 18, Jesus is answering a question asked by his disciples in verse 1. And they said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, this question seems to have arisen due to the teaching moment that we find at the end of chapter 17, where Jesus speaks to the privileges of kingdom children. The disciples still struggled to recognize the difference between earthly kingdoms and the spiritual kingdom. They assumed that God's kingdom would be like all the others that they have known, where rank and status and power and authority, those would be the markers of greatness. And so chapter 18 can therefore be considered as Jesus instructing his faithful followers about community life. And the reason for this is because within God's kingdom, there is no pyramid of power. There are no seats of greatness that Christians are to fight over, that Christians are trying to supplant each other from. There is true equality among Christians. And this is a point that I believe society diminishes in our minds because of the cry for equality and how messed up their definition of equality is. It can influence how we view equality within the Lord's church, but Christians are equal to each other. We don't have to try to supplant or knock people off of pedestals. We should not be placing people on pedestals. Given this fact, we must be striving to do right by each other because we are equals, because we are all working for the same goal. We should always be mindful to do right by each other and not try to get in each other's way. This morning, we will consider the first section that I have called "Do Not Offend, but Be Mindful." And we're going to be considering Matthew chapter 18, verses 6 through 9. Do not offend, but be mindful. We'll begin with verse 6. "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea." I want you to remember that Jesus has said that the nature of a Christian is to be likened to that of an innocent child. If you look up in verse 3, he said, "Unless you are converted and become as little children." Not talking about little children as in throwing temper tantrums and fits and always wanting what they want, but talking about the innocence and the humility of children. In verse 4, he would say, "Whoever humbles himself as this little child." So when Jesus refers to the little ones who believe in me, he is speaking about those who have humbled themselves, that have become as little children. Remember, we said last week, we cannot interpret this to be a physical little child alone. While that may fit, it is not the end of the interpretation. Jesus is talking about those that have a capacity for faith and obedience, little ones who believe in me. These are faithful followers of Jesus. These are Christians. The whoever that we find at the beginning of the verse is general in nature. But we must understand that we are among the whoever. Oh, when we read whoever causes, what do we automatically want to do? We want to consider someone on the outside. We want to consider someone from the world that is having an adverse effect on a brother. No, we ourselves are among the whoever. So when he says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, we better make sure we are not the one doing the causing. What action is being warned against in this verse? I really prefer the way the King James reads when it comes to this verse because I think it clearly answers the question. The King James reads, but whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me. You see, it's important for us to understand that the action warned against is putting something before our brethren that could lead to sin. The word offend in the Greek is the word scandalizo. Maybe you heard a word that we often use, scandal. But I want you to listen to what the Greek is translated to. It means a trigger of a trap on which the bait is placed, and when touched by the animal, springs and causes it to close, causing entrapment. Now there is a mental picture of what offending is. I'm sure everyone has had experience with a mouse trap before. And you put a little bit of cheese or a little bit of peanut butter on that small little metal plate. And when you fold over the spring and you lock it down, what is it that is going to set off that trap? It's that little plate. When it is moved, that springs the trap. What Jesus is saying is, whosoever puts a trap in front of a fellow Christian, that's who he's referring to. Now, am I guilty only when you set the trap off? Am I guilty only when you take the bait, or am I guilty just by placing the trap? Am I guilty just for setting it to begin with? This is why I like the way the King James reads, because you can read, I have the New King James listed above, and someone could read that and come away thinking that the end result is the only thing that matters. Well, I know they could have stumbled. I know I put that there, but they didn't. They didn't stumble. They didn't fall for the trap. Therefore, I am not guilty because they did not sin. You see how we can think wrongly about that? That our guilt is predicated only on what they decide to do? That's not what Jesus is saying. That we're only guilty if they become guilty. He said, you are guilty just for setting the trap. In the Wycliffe Bible Dictionary, under the entry for the word offense, it says the following. It says, there seem to be two basic ideas regarding the term offense. any stumbling or slipping of one's own. We get that. Looking at ourselves whenever we fall short, whenever we mess up. But notice what else it goes on to say. And any occasion of the stumbling or slipping of another. The fact that a fellow Christian avoided the trap you set does not negate your being guilty of setting the trap to begin with. Jesus says that it would be better that a millstone be hung around the neck of one who tries to trip a brother up, and that person be drowned in the sea. This begs the question, better than what? What is this better than? Under no circumstance would I say that this option sounds better than something else, especially when you look at the word that Jesus uses. He is very specific in what he says. The word millstone is a compound word, milos onakos. It means a great or a heavy millstone. And they even attach to the definition pertaining to a donkey. You see, this millstone is so large that a man was incapable of moving it himself. These were the large industrial-sized millstones that required a donkey walking around in a circle with a lever attached to the millstone, using it to grind whatever they were grinding. This is a very large stone. And Jesus says it's better should a stone of that caliber be tied around the neck of a person and they be thrown into the sea. It signifies the impossibility of escape. There's no getting away from this. As it pulls you by the neck down to the crushing depths of the sea, there is no chance of untying the knot. Once you are thrown off that cliff or off that boat with that millstone and it is dragging you down, no amount of effort is going to free you from that rope. And this is better? Jesus says it would be better for this to happen as it compares to experiencing the wrath of a just God because you sought to offend. This would be far better. Because God does not take it lightly when anyone seeks to trip up one of His. God does not sit back and say, well, good try, you almost got him. No. God looks at that and Jesus says, it would be better if you were just drowned by this huge rock than to experience the just wrath of God that will come upon such an individual. And so I want you to consider the question then, do you see your brethren? Do you see them for who they are? Do you recognize them as being children of God? Do you acknowledge them as being heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, just like you? That's how we are to see our brethren. Not as someone on a pedestal that I am seeking to supplant, not as someone that I see below me that I want to keep from coming up where I am. No, we see our brethren for who they are, children of God. And when we view them in that way, we need to be mindful of their souls just as we are mindful of our own. Verses 6 through 9, talking about the seeing, or verse 6 rather, the seeing of our brethren. as being redeemed by the blood of Christ, being equal to us. Jesus goes on to say in verse 7, he talks about the surety of offenses. In verse 7, he says, "Woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes." Jesus acknowledges the reality of a fallen, sin-laden world. He's not living in some fairyland, fairy tale, where everything is just perfect. He understands the state of the world. In the word woe that he uses, woe to the world and woe to that man, woe is not merely an expression of grief or sorrow. Sometimes that's how we tend to use it. Oh, woe is me. But as Jesus used it, it's a pronouncement of impending judgment. We could read it as, should you continue on your current path, you will be found guilty and receive just punishment. That's the woe that Jesus is using. Judgment upon the world because of offenses, he says. In the world, those who have no consideration for God and His ways, they have no issue with causing each other to stumble and causing Christians to stumble. They do not care who they hurt to get to where they want to go or who they have to step on to get a leg up. It doesn't matter to them. Their neighbor, their family, their friends, they'll just step on anybody. They'll offend whoever they need to offend to achieve what they want to achieve. Jesus says with surety that causes for stumbling will be present, and the world will be judged for such. The world is going to try to cause us to stumble. Just look at the scenarios that are going on in the world today. The pressures that the world puts on the church to accept that which God has called immoral, for the sake of science, for the sake of women's rights, for the sake of love, and all these other excuses that they use. The world is trying to cause us to stumble, and for that they will be judged. But Jesus offers another pronouncement of judgment: the individuals who place the means of offense. Yes, offenses will be present, but let them not come by our hands. Let them not be the result of our own actions. This is why having an attitude of humility is so important. Because instead of focusing on the elevation of ourselves, we need to be mindful of the edification of others. Not the elevation of self, but the edification of you. And if each and every child of God had that mentality, we would be in such a great place. The church would be so strong. But the problem is, in many areas, the elevation of self has overtaken. And the promotion of what I want and what I like has come to the forefront instead of what's best for my brother. And what does God want? Jesus says offenses are going to be there. We live in this world. We are going to have opportunity to stumble. But let's make sure we are not the cause of that to our own brethren. So he addresses the seeing of our brethren. He addresses the surety of the offenses that will be there. Warns against us being the cause of them. And in verses 8 and 9, he talks about the seriousness of offenses. Matthew 18, beginning in verse 8, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hell fire. Now, throughout the centuries, many have taken these 2 verses quite literally. But this is what Jesus is commanding one do. Now, I ask you, if Jesus is commanding this in a literal sense, what would we look like? Well, for one thing, we wouldn't know because we wouldn't have any eyes, would we? Oh, we would have lost them a long time ago. We would just be legless, armless, eyeless lumps of flesh rolling around doing nothing. Jesus is not talking in a literal sense. He is using hyperbole to describe the seriousness of sin. Hyperbole is an extravagant exaggeration that is used to emphasize a point. The practice of physical mutilation in response to sin is nowhere commanded in God's revealed Word. Nowhere are we told to practice such. Physical mutilation, physical abuse, that is not commanded of God. And so what we want to consider, who is Jesus using such vivid language to describe? He is speaking in a very pointed way. Who is it intended for? I submit he is addressing those on both sides of offending. Those who have something placed before them are responsible for their actions. Should they choose to sin, they will be held accountable for that choice. But on the other side of that, those who attempt to make their brothers stumble are also responsible. They will be held accountable for their attempt. Going back to the first point, whether it's successful or not, they are going to be held accountable for the attempt. I want to illustrate this with a very, very hypothetical situation. And you'll see why I say very, very hypothetical as we develop it. But let's say myself, Kris Cobell, and Evan go out for a guys' night. And I'm using their names because I know they wouldn't mind. And when you think of it, Casebolt, Cobell, and Krug sounds like a really bad law firm that I would not trust with anything. But the 3 of us, we decided to go out for a guys' night. And so we hit the bowling alley. And we're just having a great time. We're enjoying ourselves. We're just having the best evening. And I suggest, it's just us guys here. Let's liven up this party and get around the beers. All right, we're here at the bowling alley. There's nobody here. Let's just get around the beers and really, really enjoy this evening. Now, what have I just done? I have put a means of offense in front of them. I have put something in front of them that could cause them to sin. Kris says, no, I'm good, We shouldn't be doing that. We don't need to be drinking any beer to have a good time. We're having a good time now. I'm like, oh, come on, it's just one. Let's just cut loose and have fun. I persist to the point where Kris decides that he just needs to leave. He just has to get out of there. What has he just done? He has avoided the offense. He didn't take the bait. He didn't fall for the trap. He removed himself from that situation. So it's just me and Evan. I'm like, oh, come on. Okay, you and me, let's just have one. Evan decides to go along and have a beer. That's why I say this is hypothetical. Evan wouldn't do that. I know he wouldn't do that. And I wouldn't offer it, okay? So, me and Evan, we're at the bowling alley. We each have a beer. Now, I have sinned not only by drinking an alcoholic beverage, that I have no business doing, but I've also encouraged my brothers to do the same. Evan has sinned because he gave in and had a beer with me. Kris avoided the offense by leaving. He got away from it. And so we think, oh, it's just one beer one night. Ha ha, we had a great time. Kris really missed out. We go on. As the instigator of all this, what I didn't see was that this was the first step in Evan's life of alcoholism now. Oh, he got a taste for it. Ooh, that's pretty good. I like that. And so now when he goes home, he decides, you know what, I'm going to have some more of that. And it becomes a problem. It starts to consume his life. It starts to deplete the finances. He can't go to work because he's hungover. He's going out places so he can get a drink. Now, absolutely, Evan is accountable every time he lifts a drink to his lips. He is responsible for those decisions. But I also am accountable for my actions that resulted in him getting to that place. Because I put a stumbling block, an offense in front of him to begin with. Now we say, oh, well, that's extreme. That's going a little far with it. Are you telling me 20 years later, who's to say that Evan may not have taken a drink at some point down the road? Yeah, who's to say? But what I can say with certainty is I invited him to do it. I encouraged him to do it. And I am guilty of that just as he is guilty of participating. As concerned as we ought to be about our own spiritual health, we must also be concerned about the spiritual health of our brethren. And oh, we love to fall back on what Cain said, right? What did Cain say when God said, hey, where's your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? Do you really want to use Cain as a role model? We are very much our brother's keeper. We have a responsibility to each other that we must not put anything in front of them that can cause them to sin, purposefully or otherwise. You know, the illustration that I used, I wasn't trying to supplant Evan from some seat of power that he had within the congregation. I wasn't trying to usurp his greatness. But that's not the only context in which we can offend our brethren. We can cause our brethren to stumble in everyday life. Just with that illustration, I'm guilty of the very same. Regardless of the motive, I am guilty of placing offense before my brother. Jesus says that it is better to be physically lame and spiritually whole than to be physically whole and spiritually lame. That's how serious offenses are. That's how serious sin is. He uses such vivid language to describe an imprint on his disciples, the great lengths they should go to not only avoid falling into sin themselves, but to avoid placing it before their brethren. What will you sacrifice for your own soul? If God required me to cut off my hand because I was sinning, absolutely I would do that. Would you cut off your own hand for your brother's soul? If you were tempted to put something in front of him to cause them to stumble, to cause them to sin, would you be willing to cut off your hand to prevent that? I would do that for me, but I wouldn't do that for them. That's the point that Jesus is getting across. Is that we need to be willing to sacrifice not only for our own soul, but also for our brother's soul. We need to be on guard for those that are our brothers and sisters. You know, this world is difficult enough with godless immorality just running rampant. We are comfortable, we are secure within gatherings like this because we are surrounded by like-minded individuals. But tomorrow when we go to school or we go to our jobs or we do whatever it is we do on a Monday morning, chances are we're not going to be surrounded by such like-minded people. We're going to be surrounded by just immorality bombarding us from all sides. We cannot make staying faithful even more difficult by being offensive to each other. The world is looking for us to stumble. They are looking for ways to make us sin. We cannot be that person for our brethren. We need to rise above that. We need to do better than that. We need to look for ways to edify, to lift up, not ways in which we can tear down. We need to look for ways in which we can make them more secure, not look for ways in which they are vulnerable. As we strive to interact with each other in this wonderful, God-given community, we must not offend, but be mindful of each other. This is the lesson Jesus wants to impart to His followers. It's not about who's the greatest in the kingdom. It's looking out for everyone that's in the kingdom. Do you see your brethren? Do you actively work so that you are not placing offenses? And do you understand just how serious those offenses are? And that we need to be willing to sacrifice for ourselves and for each other. Let's go forward this week, practicing in our lives ways in which we can build up, not tear down, make secure, and not look for vulnerabilities. Let's be mindful of each other and not be offensive. This community that God has prepared, He has invited everyone to become a part of. This community was purchased with the blood of His Son. And the benefits of this community include the remission of sins. It includes eternal life, reconciliation with the Creator of all things, access to His peace in your life. That is what God's community has to offer. God loved you so much, loves you so much, that He gave His Son. My question for you today, do you love Him so much that you will obey His will? Oh, I love God. I love Jesus. I love the fact that He made salvation possible, but I'm not going to obey. That's not love. God's plan of obedience is very, very simple to understand. Hearing and believing His Word. That it applies to each and every one of us. Repenting of our sins, because we cannot go on in a sinful lifestyle and expect God to just accept us as we are. Confessing the name of Christ before others, that He is the Son of God, because it is that name and that name alone which is able to bring about salvation. Being baptized for the remission of sins, where God adds you to the church, that community of believers. Well, there's nothing special about the water. It hasn't been blessed. It doesn't come from a unique source. It's just water. It's because the power is not in the water. The power is with God. And it is in that moment of humble obedience, when you offer yourself in full submission to His will, that God says, you are now mine, and I have removed your sins. And then as we come out of that water, having been reborn, not in the physical sense, we'll still have our blemishes, our aches, and our pains, but inside we have been washed. And as we begin to walk that new life as one of God's children, we strive to live for Him as part of His community. Are you ready to join His community today? Are you ready to let go of that guilt that you have been carrying around because of your sins? You can't do anything to drop it. It's like a millstone that you're just dragging around, and nothing you do will loosen it except submitting to God. If we can help you accomplish that in any way, why don't you come to the front and let us know as together we stand and sing.